On a Tuesday afternoon in November 1994, something happened at Denver International Airport that only a handful of people would ever fully understand. The date was November 14th. The time was 3:47 p.m. The place was Gate B-23 in the Western Concourse, a section of the terminal that most travelers moved through without noticing, a forgotten corner where gates clustered together and the carpet had begun to show its wear. Nobody present that day knew they were about to witness something unforgettable. The terminal had that particular gray light quality that late autumn airports acquire. Outside, snow had begun falling an hour earlier, the kind of heavy, wet snow that accumulates quickly and delays departures. Inside, the artificial lighting cast everything in a tone somewhere between institutional yellow and exhaustion gray. The carpet was the color of old coins, rust and bronze mixing with industrial gray. The chairs bolted to the gate area were upholstered in a weave that had once been meant to suggest luxury, but now mostly suggested durability. They were the color of dishwater. 3 television monitors hung from the ceiling, each displaying the same arrivals and departures board in a soft glow. The ambient sound was that particular airport hum, a jet engine somewhere in the distance, the low murmur of 100 scattered conversations, the occasional overhead announcement that nobody quite needed to hear, but everyone acknowledged through a shared slight tension. 7 people were scattered through Gate B-23's waiting area that afternoon. A mother with a sleeping child rested against her shoulder. 2 businessmen sat separately, each absorbed in laptops that had not yet become universal, but were becoming common enough that they barely drew attention. An elderly couple held hands without looking at each other, comfortable in the way of people who had done it for decades. An airport employee was polishing the glass doors, moving slowly, methodically, as though he had nowhere else to be. A woman stood at the window, watching the snow fall onto the runway with the expression of someone wondering whether this flight would ever leave the ground. And in the corner near the large window that looked out onto runway 8 sat a man in a weathered charcoal blazer and a worn Stetson hat pulled low over his eyes. He was reading a newspaper. The paper was folded into quarters. His hands were large, weathered, the hands of someone who had spent his life working, either outside or in the careful repetition of physical discipline that feels like work even when it involves acting. He was not looking at anyone. Nobody was looking at him, though several had glanced in his direction in that way people do when they notice someone who carries the particular quality of stillness that attention is drawn to. His name was Clinton William Eastwood, Jr. But nobody at Gate B-23 knew that yet. He had chosen this flight specifically because it was departing at 4:15 p.m., a time when the terminal was typically calm. He had chosen to wear clothes that would not draw attention. The blazer was from a department store, not a designer. The boots were scuffed. The hat was old. He had learned long ago that the easiest way to move through the world quietly was to look like you belonged to it in the most ordinary way possible. He had not wanted to fly to Denver at all. He was in the middle of pre-production on a film he was directing, and leaving for 3 days would set everything back by a week. But his daughter had asked him to come to her college graduation ceremony, and Clint Eastwood did not break promises to his children. So he sat in the corner of Gate B-23, reading about a trade war that would not affect his life, waiting for an airplane to take him somewhere he did not particularly want to go, thinking about camera angles and actor blocking instead of concentrating on the words in front of him. He had no idea that in approximately 12 minutes, someone's entire life was going to change. The airline employee's name was Derek. Derek was 26 years old and had worked for United Airlines for 4 years. He had started in baggage handling, moved to ground operations, and had recently been promoted to customer service, a position that required him to interact directly with passengers, which was something he had specifically requested despite warnings from everyone who had already done the job. Derek wanted responsibility. Derek wanted authority. Derek wanted authority. Derek wanted people to know that he mattered. What Derek had developed instead was a drinking problem and a resentment that had been building like pressure behind a dam for the better part of 2 years. He had taken a break 15 minutes earlier. He had gone to the employee lounge at the end of the terminal and consumed what he had told himself would be just 1 beer from the 6-pack he kept in his locker. 1 beer had tasted insufficient. 2 beers had felt reasonable. 3 beers had felt necessary. By the time he returned to gate Beast 23, Derek was carrying the particular confidence that alcohol provides to people who have convinced themselves they deserve more respect than they receive. His supervisor, a woman named Patricia, who was 62 and had worked at Denver International for 12 years, noticed immediately. "Derek," she said quietly, pulling him aside before he could approach the gate counter. "You need to take the rest of your shift off." Derek's face hardened. "I'm fine." "I'm completely fine." "You're not fine. Go home." I said I'm fine. His voice had taken on that particular defensive tone that drinkers use when they are being seen clearly. "I'm doing my job. Everything is under control." Patricia was not going to argue with him. She had learned long ago that arguing with an intoxicated person was like trying to win a chess match against someone who kept moving the pieces. She sighed, made a note on her clipboard, because there would be paperwork later, and decided that the most important thing she could do right now was keep Derek from doing anything that would get either of them fired. "Stay behind the counter," she said firmly. "Check passengers in. Do not interact with anyone unnecessarily. We are boarding flight 447 to San Francisco in 20 minutes. Derek nodded, but his nod contained a kind of smirk that suggested he understood the subtext. Patricia thought he was incapable of controlling himself. Patricia did not think he was professional enough. Patricia did not respect him. All 3 of these things were true. Derek moved to the counter, his movements slightly more deliberate than normal, the particular hypercompensation that drunk people engage in when they are trying very hard to appear sober. He began sorting boarding passes into piles. His hands were steady. His jaw was tight. For the next 10 minutes, nothing happened. The mother's child woke up and began to cry quietly. An announcement came through the ceiling speakers about a delayed flight to Houston. The snow continued to fall outside, accumulating on the runway in a way that suggested this airport would soon be operating at reduced capacity. Everything was completely normal. And then Derek looked up and saw the man in the corner. The man was still reading the newspaper. He had not moved. He was sitting in perfect stillness, the kind of stillness that most people cannot maintain. It requires either absolute peace or absolute discipline, and usually some combination of both. Derek did not know who the man was, but something about him irritated Derek intensely. It was the hat, perhaps, or the way the man sat, or the fact that the man had not once looked at Derek, had not once acknowledged his authority or position behind the counter. Or perhaps it was simply that Derek had consumed 3 beers on an empty stomach and was now in the particular emotional state where small details become enormous. Derek's supervisor was reviewing schedules at the other end of the counter, 15 feet away. Derek stood up and began walking toward the man in the corner. Nobody noticed this at first. The businessman with the laptop did not look up. The elderly couple continued holding hands, but the employee who had been polishing the glass doors paused and watched. His name was Marcus, and he had worked in airport terminals for 18 years, which meant he had developed an excellent instinct for when something was about to go wrong. Marcus saw Derek walking with the particular purposefulness that alcohol creates, and Marcus thought, "Oh no." Derek stopped in front of the man reading the newspaper. "Ticket," Derek said. The man looked up slowly from his paper. His eyes were gray-green, calm, utterly unimpressed. "I'm sorry," the man said. "Your boarding pass. I need to see your boarding pass." The man folded his newspaper carefully. He set it down on the seat next to him. He took his time. There was no anger in his movements, but there was a kind of infinite patience that suggested he had an unlimited supply of moments and was perfectly willing to spend them. "I'm not boarding yet," the man said quietly. "We're not at the boarding gate. I'm sitting in the waiting area." Derek's face flushed slightly. He understood on some distant level that he had made an error. But he had already started this, and starting something meant he had to finish it. "I make the decisions about who boards when," Derek said. "Ticket, now." The man did not reach for his ticket. Instead, he looked at Derek with the expression of someone watching a child who had just asked an unreasonable question. It was not contemptuous. It was almost sympathetic. "No," the man said simply. Then he picked his newspaper back up and resumed reading. Derek stood there for several seconds. The entire terminal had become quiet. Not silent, There was still the ambient hum of airports, the distant jet engine, but quiet in the way a room becomes quiet when everyone stops talking and starts listening. Patricia had looked up from her schedules. Marcus had stopped polishing the glass doors. The businessman with the laptop had paused, his fingers hovering above the keys. Derek's face was now a deep shade of red. He had been refused. He had been refused in front of witnesses. He had been refused by someone who was sitting in his terminal, boarding his flight, using his airport. "You need to give me your ticket right now," Derek said, his voice louder now, "or you will not be boarding this flight." The man lowered his newspaper again. He looked at Derek with the same expression, not contemptuous, still almost sympathetic, but with something else now. Something that might have been the look of someone observing a threshold they had hoped would not be approached. "Son," he said quietly, and there was something in the way he said the word son that contained decades of experience with situations exactly like this. "I have boarded every flight I have ever intended to board. I have never been prevented from going anywhere I decided to go. I suggest you walk back to your counter and let this go." It was not a threat. It was not even particularly firm. It was simply a statement of fact, delivered with the certainty of someone who had learned long ago that most conflicts can be prevented by making clear where the actual boundaries exist. It was also, Derek's alcohol-soaked mind immediately decided, an insult. "You're being difficult," Derek said. "You're being difficult and you're disrupting the terminal. I'm going to need you to come with me to speak with security." The man set his newspaper down again. He looked at Derek with what might have been sadness. "That's the last opportunity you're going to get," the man said quietly. "I'm going to give you 30 seconds to walk back to that counter. If you don't, something is going to happen that you're not going to enjoy." It was not a boast. It was not delivered with aggression. It was simply the truth, stated as a fact, the way someone might tell you that ice is cold or that fire is hot. But Derek did not walk back to the counter. Instead, Derek reached out and put his hand on the man's shoulder. Then he pushed. Time did something strange. Later, everyone who witnessed it would describe it differently. The businessman said it felt like watching something in slow motion. The elderly couple said it happened so fast they could barely process it. Marcus said it was the fastest thing he had ever seen. Patricia said she never actually saw what happened. She just understood the result. Here is what actually occurred. Derek's hand connected with the man's shoulder. Derek applied pressure, attempting to force the man to stand up, attempting to assert dominance, attempting to prove that his uniform meant something and that he mattered. The man's hand moved. That was the first thing that happened. His hand moved upward and outward, a motion that was almost gentle, almost casual, redirecting Derek's arm and creating a situation where Derek's own momentum began working against him rather than for him. Derek's body rotated. He was suddenly facing the wrong direction. His other hand flailed, searching for purchase, searching for something to grab, and found the boarding gate itself, the physical structure of the gate, a thick metal rail designed to control lines of passengers. Derek went forward. His body traveled approximately 8 feet through the air in the space of maybe 2 seconds. He crashed into gate B-23's structure with a sound that can only be described as a collision. His shoulder hitting the metal framework, his hip connecting with the hard plastic edge of the gate sign. Then he was on the ground. The entire terminal was silent, not the ambient quiet of an airport. Silent. The kind of silence that occurs when everyone simultaneously stops processing what they just witnessed and enters a state of pure observation. Derek was on the ground, gasping, his uniform disheveled, his confidence completely gone. He was trying to understand what had happened. His body hurt. His mind was confused. He had been facing one direction, and then he had been flying, and then he had been on the ground, and none of it had taken more than 3 seconds. The man stood up. He did not appear angry. He did not appear aggressive. He simply stood, straightened his blazer, reset his Stetson, and looked at Derek with an expression of profound disappointment. "I gave you chances," the man said quietly. "I gave you 3 of them." Then he picked up his newspaper from where he had set it down and sat back in his seat. Nobody moved. Patricia stood completely still, her clipboard hanging at her side. Marcus was still holding his polishing cloth. his mouth slightly open. The businessman had his hands frozen above his laptop keyboard. The elderly couple was watching the man in the hat with expressions that suggested they had just witnessed something they did not yet have words for. Derek was still on the ground, trying to breathe, trying to understand how the world had reorganized itself so completely. And the man in the charcoal blazer and the worn Stetson hat opened his newspaper back up and resumed reading about trade wars. The silence continued for another full minute. Then, very slowly, Patricia began walking toward Derek. "Come on," she said quietly. "We need to go to the back." Derek did not argue. He was helped to his feet by Marcus, who had set down his polishing cloth and moved to assist. Derek was unsteady, his confidence completely destroyed, his understanding of his own power completely revised. He had entered this confrontation certain of his superiority and had left it understanding, with sudden and perfect clarity, that he was not superior to anything. Patricia did not say anything as she guided Derek toward the back office. She did not need to. Everything that needed to be said had been said by physics and by consequence. As they passed the man in the corner, Derek made the mistake of looking at him. The man was watching Derek over the top of his newspaper. His eyes contained no anger, no satisfaction, no triumph. They contained something worse. They contained understanding. They contained the expression of someone who had seen this exact thing happen 1,000 times before, who understood exactly what Derek was feeling, and who felt absolutely nothing but a kind of infinite patience about it. Derek looked away. The next 7 minutes were remarkable primarily for what did not happen. Nobody called security. Nobody made an incident report. Nobody demanded that the man in the corner be removed from the terminal. Nobody even seemed particularly upset. Instead, something else happened. Something that would have been impossible to predict beforehand, but which, in retrospect, seemed completely inevitable. The businessman closed his laptop. He stood up. He walked over to the window and stood next to the man in the hat, looking out at the snow falling on the runway. They did not speak, but the businessman's presence there, the simple fact that he was choosing to stand near the man rather than away from him, communicated something. The elderly couple, after exchanging a brief glance, stood up and walked to the window as well. Again, no words, just presence. Marcus returned to his position, polishing the glass doors, but now he was polishing them slowly, moving with purpose, keeping his position in the concourse where he could continue observing. The mother with the child who had been watching the entire exchange reached down and gently woke her sleeping child. "Don't lean back," she said quietly. "Keep your eyes open. You're going to remember this moment for the rest of your life." The child, 5 years old, looked confused but nodded, and the man in the corner continued reading his newspaper. He was not reading the newspaper. His eyes were moving across the words, but his mind was somewhere else, probably back on the set of whatever film he was directing, or forward to his daughter's graduation ceremony, or simply nowhere at all, existing in that space of perfect calm that some people can access and most people never learn how to find. 15 minutes later, Flight 447 to San Francisco began boarding. The man stood up when his row was called. He collected his newspaper, his small carry-on bag, and his dignity. He walked to the gate. Patricia was working the gate desk, and when she scanned his boarding pass, her hands trembled slightly. She knew somehow, without knowing how she knew. There was something about the way this man carried himself, about the way the entire terminal had reorganized itself around him, that suggested he was not ordinary. "Have a good flight, sir," she said quietly. "Thank you," he replied. "You have a good evening." He walked down the jet bridge toward the plane. Behind him, the businessman stood up and walked to the gate as well. Then the elderly couple, then the other scattered passengers. Nobody spoke about what had happened. Nobody explained anything, but everyone somehow understood. Derek did not return to work that day. He sat in the employee lounge for approximately 2 hours, drinking black coffee and trying to understand what his body had learned about itself in 3 seconds. Around 6 p.m., he left the airport and drove to a bar on the north side of Denver, where he sat alone in a booth and tried to drink away the terrible knowledge that his invulnerability was an illusion. He did not go back to work the next day either. Or the day after that, 3 days later, Derek submitted his resignation letter to United Airlines. In the letter, which Patricia read and filed away, he simply said that he had decided to pursue other opportunities. What Derek actually did was spend the next several months thinking about everything he had done wrong. Not just the physical confrontation with the man in the hat, but everything leading up to it. The drinking, the resentment, the belief that a uniform granted him authority over other human beings, the decision to push someone who had given him multiple opportunities to walk away. Derek eventually got sober. He went to therapy. He worked as a dishwasher for a year, then as a prep cook, then eventually as a line cook in a successful restaurant. The alcohol had not been the problem. The alcohol had simply been what he used to avoid feeling the problem. The problem was that Derek had never learned how to be a person without needing to dominate other people. It took him a long time to learn that, but he did learn it. Patricia made an entry in the employee records about the incident. She wrote that Derek had become intoxicated during his shift, had harassed a passenger, and had been injured when the situation escalated. She did not mention the man's name because no one had asked for it, and she did not know it. She did not need to know it. Patricia had worked at Denver International long enough to understand that some people simply carry authority inside themselves, and that uniform and hierarchy and institutional power had nothing to do with it. For the next 26 years, until she retired in 2020, Patricia would tell the story exactly as I have just told it. She would tell it to new employees. She would tell it to her family at Thanksgiving. She would tell it to friends at dinner parties, and everyone who heard the story would understand, on some level, what it was really about. It was not about an employee getting what he deserved. It was not about violence or justice or dominance. It was about the difference between power and authority. It was about the difference between temporary strength and permanent character. It was about what it actually means to be strong, because the strongest man in that airport was not the one who flew through the air and crashed into a gate. The strongest man in that airport was the one who stood up afterward and chose not to humiliate anyone else. Marcus continued working at Denver International for another 8 years. He retired in 2002 and moved to Arizona with his wife. Occasionally sitting in his backyard at sunset, he would think about the man in the hat and what he had witnessed that day. By then, everyone who worked at Denver International knew exactly who that man had been. After the incident, it had taken airport staff approximately 6 hours to figure it out. Patricia had mentioned it to her husband, who had mentioned it to a friend, who had mentioned it to someone at another airport, and the information had traveled through the underground network of airport employees until it reached critical mass. Clint Eastwood had been at Denver International. Clint Eastwood had single-handedly disabled a drunk employee without breaking a sweat. Clint Eastwood had then done absolutely nothing to publicize this fact, had not called a press conference, had not mentioned it in an interview, had not even told the people in his life about it. He had simply gotten on a plane to San Francisco and gone to his daughter's graduation ceremony and returned to pre-production on his film. That Marcus understood was the entire point. The man did not need anyone to know about his strength. His strength did not depend on witnesses or validation or publicity. His strength existed simply as a fact about himself, the way some people are tall, or some people are kind, or some people know how to listen. Some people are simply strong and they carry that strength quietly, and they use it only when they absolutely have to, and even then they use it sparingly and with regret. The businessman whose name was never recorded by anyone in this story worked in finance in Boulder. He never saw Clint Eastwood again, but he did something that mattered. He changed how he spoke to customer service representatives. He changed how he treated waiters and hotel staff and people whose job it was to serve him. He understood after watching that incident that kindness was not something the powerful gave to the powerless. Kindness was something that the strongest people in any room chose to give, precisely because they could afford to give it. The man in the hat had been strong enough to destroy Derek, and he had chosen instead to simply establish a boundary and then enforce it with the absolute minimum necessary force. That was the definition of real strength. The businessman carried this understanding with him for the rest of his life. He taught it to his children, he taught it to his colleagues. He built a career that was marked not by dominance but by dignity, his own and everyone else's. He died in 2019, and people who had worked with him said that he had an unusual quality. He made people feel valued. Nobody knew exactly why. They just knew that being around him meant understanding that you mattered, and that mattering did not depend on your job or your salary or your position in some hierarchy. It depended only on the fact that you were a human being. The elderly couple never found out who the man in the hat had been, and they never wanted to know. They had witnessed something pure that afternoon, a moment where true strength revealed itself, and knowing the man's name would only have corrupted that purity. What they knew was enough. They had seen someone choose restraint, choose mercy, choose dignity, even after they had the absolute right to choose something else. They had seen that such choices were possible. They had seen that strength and kindness did not contradict each other. They were, in fact, the same thing viewed from different angles. This understanding deepened their already strong marriage. They began looking at everyone they met differently, not as threats or obstacles or supporting characters in their own story, but as people who were carrying their own invisible burdens, people who were doing the best they could, people who deserved patience and respect even when they were difficult. They died within 2 weeks of each other in 2008, after 62 years of marriage. Their children said that the defining characteristic of their parents' relationship had been an unusual gentleness with each other, not weakness, but the kind of gentleness that only develops when two people understand. At the deepest level, that true power means choosing not to hurt people you could hurt if you wanted to. Clint Eastwood never told anyone about what happened at Denver International Airport. Not his daughter, who eventually found out from a friend who had heard it from a friend. Not his producers or his actors or his close friends. Not the media, which eventually caught wind of the story and tried to press him for details. When a reporter once asked him directly about the incident, he said simply, "I don't think about that," and he meant it. To him, the incident was not something worth contemplating. A man had pushed him. He had responded with the minimum force necessary. Another man had learned a lesson. That was the entire sum of the matter. What mattered to Eastwood was not what happened in the airport. What mattered was what happened next. It was the films he directed. It was the time he spent with his children. It was the quiet moments in his life when nobody was watching and nothing was being recorded and he could simply exist. Because that was the entire philosophy. True strength is not performed. It is not validated. It is not recorded or witnessed or celebrated. True strength simply exists as a fact about yourself. And if you are using it correctly, most people will never even notice it. 6 weeks after the incident at Denver International, Patricia was working the gate desk when a letter arrived addressed to her. Personal. The envelope was plain. The handwriting was neat and economical. There was no return address. Inside was a handwritten note and 2 first-class airline vouchers. The note said, "Dear Patricia, I owe you an apology. Your employee acted poorly that day, but the responsibility for that moment lies partly with me. I could have handled things more gracefully, and I should have. Please take these vouchers as a small gesture of my respect for your professionalism under difficult circumstances. Sincerely, Clint." Patricia read the note 3 times. Then she went to the back office and found Derek's resignation letter in the filing cabinet. She looked at his name, thought about where he probably was by now, and understood something fundamental about the world. The strongest person in any room is not the one who causes pain. The strongest person is the one who understands pain and chooses mercy anyway. That was the only thing that mattered. Patricia never used the airline vouchers. She kept them in a frame in her office for the rest of her career, not as proof that she had been connected to a celebrity, but as a reminder that strength and kindness were not opposites. They were the same thing, viewed from a great height. 73 people passed through Gate B23 during the hour following the incident. None of them knew what had happened, but somehow, subconsciously, they sensed that they were moving through a space where something important had occurred. The energy of the terminal was different. People were kinder to each other. A businessman helped an elderly woman with her luggage. A teenager gave up a seat for a tired woman. A grumpy man waiting for a connecting flight actually smiled at a small child. The terminal, for 1 hour, became a place where people were choosing kindness, not because they were trying to impress anyone, but because they had absorbed something from the air itself. They had absorbed the knowledge that when true strength enters a space, everything changes. The weak begin to understand that cruelty is exhausting. The arrogant begin to understand that dominance is fragile. The kind begin to understand that they are not helpless. The strong begin to understand that their strength is most powerful when least displayed, and the entire world for a moment becomes more gentle. None of this story is particularly about Clint Eastwood. Finally, it is not about how he overpowered a drunk employee or how he handled an embarrassing situation or how he was vindicated by events. The story is about Derek, who learned something he needed to learn, that the world does not revolve around him, that authority means nothing if it is not backed by actual capability, and that capability means nothing if it is not balanced by restraint. The story is about Patricia, who understood that managing people is not about control but about wisdom and compassion. The story is about Marcus and the businessman and the elderly couple, all of whom witnessed something they could not have been taught in any classroom. They witnessed the practical demonstration that strength is never about proving yourself to other people. Strength is about how you treat people when you know with absolute certainty that you could harm them if you wanted to. The man in the hat chose kindness. He chose restraint. He chose to establish a boundary and then to enforce it with the absolute minimum of force necessary. And because he did, everything changed. Not just for Derek, who eventually understood what he had been doing wrong, but for everyone who witnessed it. For Patricia, who carried that lesson for 26 more years. For Marcus, who died understanding what true strength looked like. For the businessman who made other people feel valued for the rest of his life. For the elderly couple who built a marriage on the foundation of knowing that power and gentleness were not opposites. All because one man, one afternoon in November, decided to be who he actually was instead of who other people needed him to be. The strongest man in any room is not the one who is feared. The strongest man is the one who chooses not to use his strength except when absolutely necessary. And even then, he chooses not to humiliate the person he defeats. Because that is the only form of strength that actually lasts. That is the only form of strength that changes the world. That is the only form of strength worth having.